Stanford White was one of the leading architects in America before his sudden and grisly demise. One of Stanford White's first commissions was when he was called on to design a replacement for the financial flop that was Madison Square Garden. After a series of renamings and varied attempts at profitability, the garden remained a commercial failure. Its open roof made it freezing in winter and sweltering in summer, and a new solution was sought. The land and building were sold by the Vanderbilt family to the Madison Square Company, which had formed in May 1886. White's Madison Square Garden was completed in 1890. The building dominated the skyline. It boasted a tower of some 32 stories, making it the second tallest building in New York upon its completion. Its immense main hall was the largest such room in the world. In a townhouse of 22 West 24th Street, just off Madison Square, White had constructed an opulent, multi-storied den of luxury and sin. Here, he would lure young girls, seduce them, and add them to his long list of conquests. One such young lady was 16-year-old Evelyn Nesbit. Evelyn had been born Florence Nesbit in 1884 to a Pennsylvania lawyer father and a doting Victorian mother. But when Mr. Nesbit died unexpectedly in 1895, his family was left almost penniless. They lost their house and eventually found themselves moving from their native Pittsburgh to Philadelphia as Mrs. Nesbit searched for work. She eventually found it, becoming a saleswoman at Wanamaker's department store next to City Hall. Being that this was an age before child labor laws, Mrs. Nesbit was likewise able to call on her two young children to join her in working at Wanamaker's. It was then, while working the counter at the store, that 14-year-old Florence caught the eye of an artist who was struck by the young girl's beauty. Florence earned $1 for her 5-hour modeling job, and it provided her with connections to a wide array of wealthy and respected artists and patrons, all of whom demanded the girl pose for them. As the money began to pour in more regularly, Florence quit her job at Wanamaker's to model full-time. She soon became the toast of Philadelphia's aristocratic art scene, posing for portraits, posters, and stained glass. In 1990, the Nesbits moved to New York. Florence convinced her mother to allow her to audition for stage shows in the newly emerging theater district along Broadway, near what is today Times Square. And so, in July of 1901, Florence became a chorus girl in the long-running musical Florodora at the Casino Theater on Broadway. The more seasoned dancers in the show dismissed 16-year-old Florence, nicknaming her Flossie the Fuss. Displeased by this demeaning moniker, Florence changed her name to Evelyn shortly thereafter. It was during her time in Florodora that Evelyn was introduced to the 47-year-old architect, Stanford White. A notorious womanizer, White immediately selected Evelyn as his new object of affection and attention, showering her with gifts, valuable introductions, and money to support her family. One day, Evelyn was invited to dine at Stanford's 24th Street apartment, a place she had been many times before without incident. But on this visit, White unveiled to Evelyn the Mirror Room, a 10-by-10 room paneled entirely with mirrors. Amazed by the spectacle, Evelyn continued drinking champagne before blacking out. She awoke the next morning in bed with White, her virginity gone. White made her promise not to tell anyone what happened, her mother in particular, and as Mrs. Nesbit had made Evelyn swear to obey Mr. White, she did just that. The affair between the two continued for a time, but before long, Stanford White's appetite for the young and new saw him moving on to other conquests. It was around this time that Evelyn met a fantastically wealthy railroad heir from Pittsburgh by the name of Henry Kendall Thaw. Thaw was in his early 30s, dark-haired and baby-faced. Thaw proposed to Evelyn many times. She refused many times. Mad with frustration, he demanded to know why she wouldn't accept his proposal. Over the following hours, he pried out of her every excruciating detail of that night in the Mirror Room with Stanford White. Swinging between fits of weeping and rage, Thaw blamed Mrs. Nesbit, accusing her of being an unfit mother for entrusting her daughter to White. The couple eventually married on April 4th, 1905. Harry took it up as his solemn duty to expose Stanford White for the monster that he perceived him to be. As he conspired to destroy White's reputation, Thaw became increasingly paranoid, convinced that White had hired men to kill him. He began carrying a gun. On June 25, 1906, Harry and Elvin had a stopover in New York before boarding a ship for a European vacation. Harry had purchased tickets for the pair to attend the opening night staging of a new musical at the Cabaret Theater atop Madison Square Garden's roof. Before the show, they stopped in for dinner at Café Martin, a block west of the Garden at 26th Street and 5th Avenue. There, too, dined none other than Stanford White. Enraged, Thal remained distant and agitated all night and throughout the show. At 10:55 p.m., as the show was concluding, White finally arrived and took up his usual table in the front row. Afraid of what her husband might do, Evelyn tried to pull Harry towards the elevators to leave, but he pulled away from her and marched straight up to White, who likely knew nothing of Thal's obsessive hatred of him. The New York Times recorded the details of what happened next. White must have seen Thal approaching, but he made no move. Thal placed the pistol almost against the head of the sitting man and fired 3 shots in quick succession. White's elbow slid from the table. The table crashed over, sending a glass clinking along with the heavier sound. The body then tumbled from the chair. Thal was later escorted from the theater by the police. His murder hearing would be among the first to be called the trial of the century. Thal was held in the notoriously unpleasant Tombs prison, though he was shown preferential treatment by the guards. The media sensation surrounding the trial was unprecedented, leading the jury to be sequestered from the public, the first time this had ever happened in American law.